my perspective is as an evaluation practitioner. And so I had many clients who came to me and said they wanted to study engagement, but it was often the case that they didn't have a good working definition for what that actually meant. And then several years ago, I came across the engagement survey from the Activation Lab. And that is what we've been using ever since, or at least that's what we use to start the conversation. So if a client says they want to measure engagement, then and they don't have a definition, then that's often what we use to start thinking about that together and deciding whether that's how we want to define engagement or whether they actually had something else in mind. I think about the items on that scale as measuring how sort of locked in to a learning experience the participant actually is. So how are they feeling? How are they thinking? What are they doing during that experience? And is it focused on the activity itself? So I also do some work with AAAS. They think of, and with their public engagement with science group. And so I think part of the different ways that people define engagement, some people are actually talking about the activity itself, and other people are talking about how you felt, or how locked in you were during that activity. So public engagement with science and the way that AAAS defines it is really about the interaction and the extent to which that engagement between a scientist and publics was reciprocal and allowed for people to learn mutually, so that the scientists are learning alongside the publics and vice versa. That's about the activity. We've used the term engagement to measure how often something happens. So if you have the possibility of continuing to do some sort of an informal learning activity over and over again, the number of times you do that and how long you do it can also be called engagement. And so there are lots of different ways that the word gets used, and it's not always as a construct that could be considered an outcome of an activity. Sometimes it's about the activity and how much you've done the activity itself. When I discovered the Activation Lab, the lovely thing about Activation Lab is it talks about engagement in this much bigger context. And so you can think about engagement as it's measured on the survey itself, but then you can think about how it plugs into this larger idea of a learner who's continuously engaged in science. And so I think ideas like that help. Public engagement with science piece, I was fortunate enough to be involved in some of the early sort of revision of how that was defined. So AAAS has a theory of change around that. They have a logic model, they have a typology, and I was involved in little bits and pieces of that work. And so I got to watch them sort of ideate around, like, what is this? How are we going to define it? And how are we going to try to make it concrete enough that people can actually go out into the world and make decisions about whether what they're seeing is public engagement with science or whether it's not. And then if it is public engagement with science, how do we begin to evaluate that? How do we begin to study that in a more systematic way?